Welcome to the DLF Project Managers Group webinar. Thank you so much to Nina, Simon, and Elizabeth for presenting today. We're so grateful. Their talk is entitled Experimenting with AI Technologies, Transforming Library Workflows at Emory University. This session is being recorded and we'll have a Q&A at the end. And with that, Nina and Simon will begin. Thank you. Take it away.
Okay. Share my screen. Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Nina Rao, and I'm going to start us off with just a brief overview of Whisper before Simon gets into talking about how we're using it at Emory. So Whisper is an automated speech recognition tool developed by OpenAI. It can run locally without sending your data anywhere, and it generates descriptive data for audiovisual content, which can be used to enhance accessibility. And accessibility in this context refers to inclusive practices that enable users of all abilities to interact with, use, and understand collection materials. So Whisper can create captions, subtitles, and transcripts. Captions are text versions of speech and non-speech audio information displayed in sync within a media player. Subtitles are text versions of spoken audio translated into another language, also displayed in sync in a media player. And lastly, transcripts are text versions of speech and non-speech audio information. They may include description of visual content and are often viewed separately from a media file. So with that said, I am going to turn things over to Simon.
Thank you, Nina. All right, let's begin. Next slide. All right, so as Nina mentioned, my name is Simon O'Riordan, and I am a metadata librarian at Emory University. Today, we'll be discussing the progress and insights gained from working with the Whisper software on digitized AV materials as part of a Lyrasis Catalyst grant awarded in 2023. Nina will mention this later in the presentation, but I want to emphasize at this point that currently at the Emory Libraries, we are interested in using Whisper locally on individual computers. We have found that this was a good balance for us in relation to data privacy and ease of installation and use. Other institutions may find that a different configuration suits them better, whether that is running Whisper using a server cluster, or to run Whisper via an online platform such as Hugging Face. So the purpose of the grant was to evaluate the Whisper software as part of our AV digitization workflow at the Emory Libraries, while at the same time providing documentation for other individuals and organizations who would be interested in using Whisper. We wanted to gather information that would be useful to a wide audience, and this includes what types of content Whisper is good at and not so good at. Additionally, it would include information regarding the setup of Whisper, as well as some baseline statistics for accuracy and processing times for the desktop computers running it. All of this documentation was assembled into a white paper, which will be published publicly by Lyrasis. The majority of the money, back up, still on the same slide. The majority of the money used from the grant was to hire student editors who would review the raw Whisper output for accuracy, correcting any mistakes in content and formatting, and then recording this information. Over the course of the grant, we have had 12 student editors, 9 undergraduate and 3 graduates, and we currently are employing about 5 students. None have had any Whisper experience prior, and only a few have had experience with oral histories or transcription. All right, next slide. All right, so with students, they needed material to work on and tools to use. So since Whisper was relatively new at this time, we wanted to test the software across a variety of materials in terms of audio quality, subject matter, and format. So from this, we picked 250 content hours of material, totaling 434 items across 5 different collections. And these range from lectures, interviews, sermons, and as you will see in a little bit, public access variety shows. In parallel, we acquired the necessary hardware and software for the project. To broaden the utility of our data, we purchased both a PC and Mac to run Whisper using consumer-grade parts that anyone could purchase. And for software, we ran Whisper version 3 on the PC and Whisper C++ on the Mac. And on the slide, you can see some of the parameters we set for Whisper. And then we also used Cadet, which is a caption editing tool designed by GBH. And this was selected because we have had previous experience working with it. And then finally, in consultation with the oral history program staff at the Emory Libraries, we had a programmable gaming mouse and a foot pedal installed at each student workstation to allow for easier use of the Cadet software while viewing the Whisper output. The general workflow for the project involves student editors claiming an item in Airtable, loading the corresponding raw output from Whisper and the media files into Cadet, and then editing the files for both content accuracy and formatting. Formatting included making sure timestamps were synced properly, and because we are following the CEA 608 standard, making sure each line of text did not contain more than 32 characters. For the purposes of this project, each item was reviewed twice by different students. During the first pass, the students primarily looked at accuracy, fixing any content mistakes. And during the second pass, they focused more on formatting, as well as fixing any mistakes that were missed by the first reviewer. And so these images are of Whisper. The one on the right is a screenshot of Whisper in action, and the image below is a text file of a Whisper output. All right, so now I'm going to try to do a quick demo of Whisper. So I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a second. Oh, you have to stop sharing your screen. Yeah, sorry. All right. So I'm going to play this file. There'll be some classical music, hopefully not too loud. I'll lower it down a little bit just in case. So this is Whisper running on the command line. So right now it's loading the file, and in a few seconds, it'll start working.
Good morning and welcome to Grand Rounds. We'll go ahead and start despite the inclement weather. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker this morning, who's Professor Nikolai Trapeznikov. Professor Trapeznikov is the director of the All-Union Cancer Research Center at the Russian Academy of Medical Sciences, which I believe is roughly the equivalent to the National Cancer Institute, the NIH.
You can, let me stop my share and you can go back. So just a few points. I did not specify what language that file was in. Whisper detected it on its own using the first 30 seconds. You could also see that there was timestamps on the left, breaking up the speech. And then it quickly sped up and was much faster than the actual audio being displayed. So just a few little points there. All right, so next slide. Okay. So this is a graphical depiction of the workflow. The student editors were divided into two groups based on experience. One group focused on first pass reviews, while the other group worked on second passes. And so this allowed the work to be done in parallel. And in general, we had graduate students working on second passes and undergraduates working on first passes. Next slide. So this is a screenshot of Cadet, which is the editing software we used. On the left is the caption and timestamps being edited, while the video would be playing on the right. And so overall, we have been pleased with Cadet during the course of this project. We've had no major errors and the students have enjoyed using it. All right, one last share. So if you can stop sharing, I'm going to show the final end product in Aviary, which is our public display platform. Give me 1 second. So this is a raw Whisper output that I just put into Aviary with the media file, so you can see it in action when I play it. And hopefully you will get sound. If you cannot, please let me know and I'll redo it.
Welcome to a dialogue with Sam Nunn, an in-depth discussion of vital issues of national interest. Now, your host for dialogue, U.S. Senator Sam Nunn.
I'm delighted to be able to introduce for the second time on this program a man who is thought of throughout the country and throughout the world as being one of the most powerful people in government. Several years ago, he headed up the Atomic Energy Commission. He went from there and headed up the Central Intelligence Agency. Then he became Secretary of Defense, and now he is going to be the new Energy Secretary, assuming we ever create a Department of Energy, which I hope will happen.
You don't need to hear us that much Sam Nunn today. Okay. So let me stop sharing. And then you can go back, Nina. So as the students worked on the files, they recorded various data points in Airtable. And Airtable is a web-based kind of database / spreadsheet software. And we chose Airtable because we used it to manage library projects in the past, and we found it to be very convenient and flexible. The information the students recorded included the amount of time taken to do a review, the date when the pass was completed, and any notes about the Whisper output. They also used Airtable to store the completed caption files. Next slide. To assist the students, many of whom did not have much contextual knowledge about the collections that we picked, we created a series of style guides, one for each collection. These were embedded in one large document that also contained more generic advice on how to transcribe the content and the importance of the work. Each style guide provided specific information on the collection, including historical context and possible things that Whisper might trip up on, such as collection-specific jargon or portions of the collection that might have poor audio quality or multiple speakers at once, which are things that Whisper often gets tripped up on. For example, one of the sets of material tested was the Sam Nunn collection, which you kind of saw a short snippet of just now. And it contains the papers of Sam Nunn, who was a United States Senator from Georgia, who served from 1972 to 1993. The students worked on press conferences as well as episodes of his local current event show, A Dialogue with Sam Nunn. So this particular style guide included information on who Sam Nunn was, websites and databases for names of members of Congress, government-specific terminology, and well as potential pitfalls, including variable audio quality of the press conferences and the plethora of acronyms used in government work. Give me 1 second. Okay, next slide. Because this work was new to all of us, we also created a question log for the students. So students recorded their questions in this shared document, though they could remain individually anonymous. So these questions were then answered by Nina and myself on a weekly basis in the same document. And so this allowed information to be shared with the students quickly and prevented any duplication of questions. And so the data gathered here will be then used for future documentation because it has given us a better sense of the information gaps that needed to be filled. Next slide. So we now come to the charts and graphs section of the presentation. So this first slide shows the processing time of the 5 collections divided between running baseline Whisper on a PC desktop computer and running Whisper C++ on a MacBook. Processing times were tracked on the PC via git bash command, while it was tracked on the Mac via the built-in time command. Processing times were similar between the 2 Whisper variants overall, as you can see. Next slide. So this slide shows the average processing time for Whisper per content hour. While the time is relatively similar between the two, Whisper C++ was generally faster in processing. Give me 1 second. I have lost my place. Okay, next slide, please. Before I share the accuracy chart, which I'm sure is what most of you are especially interested in, just a few points. So we are using the word error rate to assess accuracy. To do this, we are running a Python script that compares the raw Whisper output with a student-edited version and comparing differences at a word level. Word error rate is not 100% foolproof, however, since not every word has the same importance in terms of overall understanding, as shown in the examples listed, but it is widely used as a metric and offers a good baseline. So next slide. So with that, here is what we found for accuracy for baseline Whisper for the PC, as well as Whisper C++ running on the Mac. For baseline, we compared specifying the language of the file prior to processing versus letting Whisper detect the language automatically, as you saw in that brief demo earlier. We had heard that there were differences in accuracy in doing so, and we wanted to see for ourselves. Overall, specifying no language was an improvement over the alternative on average. However, there were a number of files where specifying English performed better, so it might be worth looking into as an option at your own organization. From what we have seen, Whisper generally works best on measured and steady speech, such as a lecture or a sermon, and these results reflect that. Surgical Grand Rounds, which is a series of medical lectures, took the least amount of student review time since mistakes were generally minimal. On the other end of the spectrum, American Music Show, which was a budget public access variety show filled with multiple people speaking at once, often a mix of song as well as people talking, created a lot of problems for Whisper and caused a lot of extra student editing time needed, which is kind of what we expected before we even started this project. Regarding the surgical grand round results, we had 2 files that were processed as complete gibberish, and we are still investigating why that happened. Without those 2 results, the word error rate for no language specified would be 2.57%. As for the Whisper C++ results, well, you take the good with the bad in this situation. We are not exactly sure what is causing the extreme values seen, but it is possible that the settings we selected for baseline Whisper just do not work for Whisper C++. It's definitely something that we are still looking into, and there are other options for running Whisper on Macs products. So with that, I will now hand things over to Nina, who will discuss some of the problems encountered with the project, as well as some more insights gathered.
Yeah, okay. So Whisper has a few known tendencies with its output. One that we encountered is that Whisper's language detection sometimes identifies English as Welsh. This happened in the Surgical Grand Rounds collection with a speaker with a prominent Scottish accent, but apparently it can happen with a wide variety of accents. So you can see some of that output here. The Welsh, when translated, does not match the actual spoken content. From the Whisper GitHub page, this tendency seems to have been improved, so this may not be as prevalent as it used to be. Another problem is Whisper's tendency to repeat a line over and over, especially in segments with silence or no speech. So in my favorite example of this, Whisper output 1,000 caption blocks that said we're going to be doing a lot of work. So we are going to be doing a lot of work. There are some settings with Whisper that can be adjusted to address this, such as the no speech threshold. So that is probably something we need to experiment with more. And finally, we found that Whisper sometimes inserts plausible sounding but made up text in the middle of actual content. So in the example here, the underlined text is made up and doesn't exist in the video, but it seems plausible. Oil prices might go down. I don't know. This type of error is really concerning to us because it's not as obviously false as the others. If you weren't listening to the source content, you really wouldn't know that this is made up. We encountered this most frequently in our Sam Nunn materials, which are talk shows and press conferences pertaining to economic and political issues. So it seems like Whisper may be more apt to make predictions in those subject areas. It also tends to insert references to President Obama with these videos, even though most of them are from the 70s. So it does really seem to be referencing a specific era of political and economic history and then interpreting speech through that lens. As far as implementing this into our digitization workflow, as Simon has mentioned, we are focusing on a local implementation with a single workstation, so not something involving server clusters or an online pipeline. Based on the experience in the grant project, we decided to go with a PC with an NVIDIA graphics card, as that seems to be the easiest to set up and provides the best performance. We set up Whisper following the installation instructions on GitHub and have been using the large model, but we are now currently trying out the new turbo model. We have a slightly different command for audio versus video files. Our video command adds max line width and line count to segment the output into appropriate lengths for broadcast captions, whereas our audio command is producing transcripts, and so it doesn't require that structure. As far as our ongoing workflow, this is basically what we're already doing. So running Whisper on media files on a workstation in our AV space, and then sending that output to student workstations for editing. But going forward, we will also be storing the Whisper output and the edited files in a preservation repository and uploading the edited files to a user access platform. So the Whisper ecosystem continues to evolve, and we can't speak to all of the modifications that exist for it, but these are some of our takeaways. So the first is that the text outputs can vary a lot depending on the model used and the command options, but also on the content. So with the medical lectures, Whisper removed almost all filler words, but with oral histories, it left them in. Another finding is that the style guide is very important for our student editors to give them context for the collections and guide editing decisions. And lastly, we found that the structure of the content has a large impact on editing time. So content where the sentences have a more predictable structure, such as lectures, tend to have more accurate output, which is quicker to edit. And dialogue that's less structured is harder for Whisper to parse, and the output tends to take longer to edit. Formatting video captions also requires additional time compared to editing audio transcripts. So the screen grab here is a transcript from an audio recording, and this format of large paragraphs broken up just by speaker changes is a lot quicker for our editors than working with captions, which are much smaller segments. So knowing the characteristics of the content is helpful in planning for editing time. Next, we've been thinking a lot about what level of human review our Whisper output should receive. So in the context of finite resources, does everything require 2 rounds of editing? Are there materials for which the direct Whisper output would be acceptable? Are unreviewed captions better than no captions at all? We have a preliminary framework which considers the characteristics of the content and user needs in prioritizing output for review. So in terms of user needs, this would be considering whether the expected use involves a legal, medical, educational, or other formal use that might have specific guidelines of its own. And in terms of the content, considering how accurate the output from Whisper is likely to be. So anything with overlapping speakers, music, or subject areas that are prone to made up text would also be prioritized for review. In terms of our workflow, we're also thinking about how to structure the storage of captions and transcripts, and about the end user experience and how to inform users about how the captions were created and what level of review they've had. So one aspect of that is documentation and metadata for captions and transcripts. So the federal agency's Digital Guidelines Initiative released a draft last year of guidelines for metadata for WebDTT files, and so we are planning to follow that. The guidelines specify information about the file's creation and then also include optional local elements which can be used to document editing or review work, the software used to create the file, or its relationship to other caption versions. In terms of the human impact of this work, the most obvious impact for end users would be greater accessibility of the content, but we're also noticing a trend where the more captions are available, the more there's an expectation that captions will be available, and the more demand there is for this work. So as more people around the library have become aware that we're doing this work, we've been asked to facilitate caption creation in contexts beyond special collections. So for example, helping faculty use Whisper with their own research, or graduate students who have interviews to transcribe. So as Whisper makes the captioning process more efficient, it also increases demand for captioning work in the library. Before we started this project, there were no positions in the library doing captioning work on a regular basis. Over the last year and a half, we've employed about 7 students at any given time, and we're currently employing about 5 students, and we expect that to continue going forward. For the students who are doing the editing, Whisper increases their capacity to provide high quality captions, and it also increases their satisfaction with the work. So the feedback from our editors is that because Whisper does the most labor intensive portion of the work, they're able to focus on the more creative aspects, making editorial choices, which they find more intellectually engaging. There are trade-offs with this approach. Students in the oral history program at Emory noted that transcribing from scratch improved their listening skills and helped them think more deeply about interview techniques. So Whisper may not be the right choice for every purpose, especially in cases where the educational experience for the transcriber is a primary goal. And we do have a forthcoming IFLA journal article which explores the human impact of our work with Whisper more deeply, which should be forthcoming, I believe, this spring. So we have a white paper forthcoming as well that will compile our findings from the grant project. So we'll have benchmarks for the work, hardware and software configurations, and our workflow. We hope that will be useful for anyone considering implementing Whisper. I've also made a couple of scripts that we've been using. One of them calculates the word error rate between Whisper generated output and a set of edited captions. The other can be used to write the FADG metadata to VTT files following the FADG guidelines. And those are both available at my GitHub page. For any questions, we can be reached at nina.rao@emory.edu or s'O'Riordan@emory.edu. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll stop share and turn things over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Nina. Thanks, Simon. Appreciate that. Let me share my own slides. So I am Elizabeth Russey Roke. I am a program manager here at Emory University for archival technology. So essentially what I do is try to figure out how we can improve the technological solutions that provide access and help us to process special collections work. What I'm going to be presenting on today is a little bit less formed. We are in a bit of an experimental position right now with the project I'm going to speak about, but I'm hoping that some of what I talk about can be useful for others who are trying to figure out how to even get started working with AI. It's really the project we've done around metadata has really been about asking big questions of AI and seeing what happens, seeing how it performs, thinking through the tasks that we have, where the resourcing that we have or the workflows or even the knowledge base that we have in-house just haven't adequately met curatorial or descriptive goals. And I'm going to talk about the use of AI with a specific collection that we have here. So the Langmuir African American Photograph Collection is one of our most heavily used digital collections. We've had it since 2012, so about 13, 14 years it's been in-house. And it's an artificially assembled collection. So a dealer from Philadelphia started collecting photographs of African-American life and history and subsequently sold that to Emory University. And the collection focuses on life and culture from about 1880 to the 1970s. While some of the photographs are recognizable figures, so the more famous Malcolm X's of the world, most of it are ordinary people from all walks of life. So it includes family snapshots, studio portraits, cabinet cards, photographic postcards, and so on. So in other words, a lot of the images that we were looking at that we've described in this collection, we don't know a lot about. They came to us with little to no provenance and little to no identification. So when we received it, we digitized it and also outsourced the metadata. So all this was outsourced. We sent it to a vendor and had them do this work, mostly for expediency, because we just didn't have the resources in-house to be able to conduct this type of work at that time. Unfortunately, what we have found, although it did help us get this collection online relatively quickly, the metadata that we got back has some problems in it. We have frequently heard complaints from researchers and from library staff that it's really hard to search because it's not very specific, and that there's a lot of misleading metadata in here or inaccurate. So a couple of examples of that. So this is a photograph with the very helpful generic title of African-American man in a suit hugging an African-American woman in a dress. So obviously incredibly generic metadata here. No context whatsoever for the image. It's a little hard to see, but if you look at the date, there was no attempt to supply a date. It's simply listed as unknown. And then if you look at the subject headings that we have here, we have African-American man and African-American woman. African-American man, for what it's worth, is shared by 80% of the collections of the objects in this collection. So it's not particularly useful even for narrowing down what you're trying to look for. A second problem that we have in this collection is inaccurate or misleading metadata. So the image that we have here depicts students, presumably, that were part of a school play. So students of Holy Rosary School dressed as sailors, Navy, and in dresses in front of stage. And I'm going to check the chat here to make sure that, okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen share. So while the image is dated here, because there was a date written on the front of the image, the subject access points are incredibly misleading. So if you look at these, the subject headings include navies and sailors. It's a class photo of kids in costumes. I'm fairly certain that there's no sailors in this photograph. There's also a heading around military uniforms, you know, and if I were a researcher looking for examples of military dress, I'm pretty sure this photograph would not be of any help to me. A third issue that we have is the one that really we felt we needed to address and have needed to address for a long time in this collection. So there's many examples of outright stereotypes and bias in here. This collection includes large amounts of photographic postcards that came from the South in the early 1900s. So there are photographs like this, which is clearly an example of a stereotyped image. Even though the image is okay, with the addition of the caption, it becomes highly problematic. There's also no attempt to date this photograph. Subject headings are very literal and limited to exactly what the person describing it saw. They saw a woman, they saw a child, and that's all they attempted to do. They didn't attempt to situate this in any type of context, to say anything about Jamaica, to say anything about the period of slavery in Jamaica at all. So I think one of the questions that comes up when we start thinking about, well, can't we just fix it? This is a collection that's been around for 13 years, and we've wanted to fix it for 13 years. A primary barrier for us has always been cost. Just sort of back of the napkin, back of the envelope math. We estimate that it takes us about 10 minutes to describe each one of these images, to research and then provide the metadata for each of these. So if we were to do this by hand with staff that we have in-house, we are guessing that it would take a full-time person an entire year to describe this collection, which is really difficult to carve out time for, especially when you have new collections coming in and different faculty interests. It's really hard to go back, particularly with legacy collections, and say, we really need to take a pause on the new stuff and go back and fix an old thing. Another thing that I think kind of led us to try and find a different approach here is just the acknowledgement that the amount of domain expertise that it really takes to describe photographic collections in particular can be really deep and may not exist within your institution. I often give the example of, you know, there are certain time periods and things that I, as a metadata professional, would have no idea how to work with and would require quite a bit of research on my part, and I probably would miss some important things. And then the final thing is just the volume here. Langmuir is 12,000 photographs. We have other collections that are larger, as I know many institutions do, particularly when we're talking about archival documents that have little or no descriptive information on the item level, like we present them in digital repositories. I think it's important to answer the question of why we turn to AI here. So we've kind of talked about the limitations. I mean, theoretically, we could have just hired some more people, although there are barriers to that. But I think AI was a solution we really liked for very positive reasons, not just because we were lacking in other areas. The first of these is that there is an administrative encouragement at Emory University. Many libraries are starting to explore this, but we have a campus-wide initiative that was launched in 2022 to really look at the potential of artificial intelligence. It sounds super corporate for me to say, but I think this administrative push has really helped Emory start to move down the road of AI, even in the library. It's sort of giving us the freedom to try something new and try to break out of some of our old molds. A second factor for AI, I think, is the sustainability and extensibility of the approach. AI is great at processing a large amount of information very quickly. So it's very attractive when you're looking at collections like Langmuir, where you have a lot of objects and that need lots and lots of work. And I think a final factor in why we looked at AI for this collection is really one of serendipity. We have internships that we support at Emory in special collections that we've had here. And we were lucky enough this year to be approached by a library science PhD student that was looking for more work in archives. And she happened to have a background in AI. So it was a really nice partnership where we could give her archival expertise and really help with the metadata, and she could help us with some of the AI pieces. I do want to mention that from the beginning of this project, we've been focused on taking the most ethical approach to this work that we can. This really wasn't a project that was about ways to automate or outsource what we're already doing. It's about looking for ways to make human-created metadata better. How can we use the advantages of machines to enhance the work that we already do? So there's a term, hybrid augmented intelligence, that is increasingly showing up in the literature a lot. And this is an approach that looks at building collaborations between humans and AI. So rather than seeing AI as a tool that's only about automating tasks, this approach involves a symbiotic relationship where you have human judgment on one side and ethical considerations that are really human sorts of tasks, and figure out how they can guide machine processing to ensure that outputs align with human values. That allows us to continue to pursue diversity, equality, inclusivity goals that we have for our information. So in other words, when we started this project, we weren't really trying to create a process that was thing in, thing out, but really a collaboration between human and machine that took advantage of each other's strengths. And this is what that looks like. So the project at the very beginning was really looking at a chatbot, which is something that I think everybody can do. So we started really, really small when we started exploring how AI could help us remediate the description for the Langmuir collection. So we asked AI to start really just to generate a title and description. Those were the only pieces of metadata that we focused on in this project to begin with. We used Anthropic's Claude 3.5 model is the model that we used. The reason we chose Claude is because it's built on a framework known as constitutional AI, which integrates ethical principles directly into its architecture. So sort of in the back of our heads, what we were hoping to do is take advantage of the fact that it already could recognize what appropriate description would look like and kind of harness that to reverse engineer it. So if it could know how to output ethical sorts of metadata, could we use that power to recognize where those standards weren't being met? The other thing we did was we conducted this work in our Amazon Web Services space. So all of our digital repository objects are maintained in an AWS cloud, which meant that we could use their Bedrock system. Bedrock is a module within AWS that provides a closed space to run AI models that doesn't provide information back to AWS. And it also doesn't provide information back to the model itself. So when we do this work, it means that we can avoid some of the thorny questions of privacy and copyright, because the information can only be seen by Emory people working on the project. So what we have here is a multi-step process where we crafted a number of queries to work with Claude. So we start with a system prompt, giving it some instructions, asking the AI chatbot to assume a certain personality, assume a certain role, and then first asked it to generate a title and a description, was the first thing we did. And then we get that information back. And then we said in the second task, we want you to evaluate the metadata we already have. So you've already generated some metadata. Now look at this, what we have, and tell us where it meets or does not meet appropriate standards. And then for the third task, we asked it to go back, look at the metadata we created, look at the metadata it created, and the analysis around those, and try to provide a sort of hybrid version of that metadata that incorporates elements of both human and machine. So here's what some of those prompts look like, and I'm happy to share these if this is helpful to anyone. So the first was that initial task 1 system prompt. We gave it no metadata, we gave it only the image and supplied it the image, and asked it to generate a title and a description based upon the available visual content. And that resulted in what we are calling machine-generated metadata. And this was to give us a baseline for evaluating the model capacity to interpret visual material with no contextual clues whatsoever, apart from the prompt itself. Notice in the prompt itself, not only did we give it a role, but we also gave it the context of the collection and tried to give it the information that we have. This is all from our finding aids, by the way, and then give it a refinement to say, here's what we want you to supply. One thing to note about this is that the prompt is very much the way that we would instruct student assistants. This is the information I would give a student when they are starting to describe a collection, is tell them why they're doing it, what I expect to get. And that's how we found working with Claude to be most effective. And here's what the output looks like from that first prompt. This is one of the sample outputs. So we're back to our photograph of the African-American man in a suit, hugging an African-American woman in a dress. And you'll notice that the AI-generated description is much more descriptive. At times, it is perhaps too descriptive, giving us, it starts to make judgment calls at a certain point. You know, they are smiling and standing close together, starting to make assumptions that we're not entirely thrilled with here, but it does do a better job of describing details in the photograph, like they're outside, this is what their clothing looks like, things that would be useful for researchers to search on. So in the second task, we made available to Claude the original human-generated metadata, the original one that we had, asked it to evaluate how accurate that was, and if it contained any bias. Did it see any problems in that with how that was described? Did it have cultural stereotyping or exclusionary language? Here is what the output from that looks like. For our sailor photograph, Claude rightly notes that the description of the photograph misses necessary contextual information. It misses the fact that the image was taken potentially in a segregated school. It was interpreting that from the date. And then finally, in task 3, we asked Claude to review the description it created, in light of the feedback of the original metadata, and try to provide a sort of hybrid description. The idea was to obtain metadata that was more accurate, inclusive, possibly aligned with reparative archival practices than the human-generated one. And you can see here it does call out talking about the history of slavery, though that did require some prompting on our part. So we ran this experiment with several images, ran them through the same workflow, and then conducted some user studies because we really wanted to see how end users really thought of what we came out with and what they preferred. So MG is machine generated. So that's what Claude did without any help from us. The hybrid generated is that third prompt. And then human generated is that HG, that is human generated. And we asked them to tell us which one they liked better, which one they thought was more helpful, which one they thought was more useful. To date, what we found in our survey is that particularly undergraduates expressed a very clear and statistically supported preference for machine-generated and the hybrid-generated titles and description over human-generated. They found it really helpful, the extra context that it gave, and were critical of descriptions that lacked information about the subjects or kind of tried to situate it within a particular context. When we asked staff were a little less enthusiastic, but saw potential for using the machine-generated metadata as a sort of first draft for the metadata that we create, rather than just having the machine just do it all for us. And content experts, a lot of the sort of wariness came from content experts who were worried that it was too specific, that it was providing context that might be seen as authoritative and limit students' inclination to probe photographs beyond what was supplied to them in the metadata description. One of the things that we found was that, as I mentioned before, the machine-generated metadata often overinterpreted relationships between subjects. So like that photograph of the man and woman hugging, it automatically made an assumption that they were in a relationship together, which may or may not be true. So it tended to lead to overly prescriptive or highly interpretive descriptions that we found that we needed to kind of curtail. The other thing that we found surprisingly was it didn't tend to hallucinate that much. We expected it to do so, and we came across a photograph where we thought that's what it was doing, and then looked it up and it was actually correct. It was information we didn't know, which is one of the things that we're particularly excited about. The potential here is for it to be able to supply information that we wouldn't know already. So I think on the whole, the experiment itself, I think it shows some promise, especially in flagging metadata that has some really serious problems in it. The hope here is that that will give us a way to prioritize content. So with Langmuir, not everything really needs fixing, but with 12,000 photographs, how are you going to find the ones that have problems when the metadata is not accurate enough for us to be able to keyword on it? And AI seems to show quite a bit of promise to be able to provide that sort of editorial first draft for us to know how to go back and fix what we need to. So we are looking at scaling up this project. That was sort of our experimental version. We are now working with Amazon's Generative AI Center. So this is something, if you are a customer of AWS, they have a program that funnels institutions that have certain use cases into projects that work with their data scientists and their developers to actually help you build a pipeline that can move into implementation. And this is what we are looking at doing right now, is to be able to feed it photographs and associated metadata if we have it, and then output structured metadata for us to be able to work with that provides that sort of first draft and saves us the research time of having to really identify these photographs and having that second opinion given to us from AI. So more to come on this. We are working on this project right now. We completed about April, at which point we will be releasing white papers and presentations to demonstrate where we got with this. So I do want to mention a couple of things about building institutional capacity for AI that I think if you haven't started, may be a way for you to start. I think that often is the hardest part, especially with a technology like AI, where you have a new methodology to learn, new tools, new applications. But AI, unlike linked data and some of the other things we've had to work with, I think AI has a special opportunity where there are chatbots that you can use. This project that I just described, this experimental project, we only use chatbots, and we spent all of $5. Obviously more in human time, but in terms of AI processing amounts, we spent $5. That was it for being able to use this. So start small. Use of a chatbot, you don't have to have anything sophisticated. I was able to do some of this prompting, and my programming experience is practically zero. Another thing that I think is important is about focus on building human capacity for AI. What that sometimes involves is involving as many people as you can on these projects. The only way to learn them, I believe, is experientially. And so staff need time to work with technologies and have the ability to experiment and have use cases, very specific use cases. Again, AI can be started with freely available tools, existing infrastructure. This doesn't require a huge lift unless you want to make it so. And then look for partnerships. Lots of people are trying to experiment with this. Think about your hosting providers. If you have one, they may be able to help with that. Here for us at an academic institution, we have AI learning centers of faculty who are experimenting with AI and students who are learning AI, and we've been able to leverage them in some of these projects to work on the more experimental pieces and help us train models and things like that. So if you're interested in seeing more of the outputs from the experimental phase of the project, you can go take this user survey. It's kind of embedded within the user survey, and you can see how we set that up. And I am happy to answer questions about this project. So feel free to contact me if you have anything else. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Simon. We are going to have questions right now, so you can put it in the chat or you can ask directly.
Yes, I'll put it in the chat right now.
Oh, Elizabeth, go ahead. You can unmute and ask.
Yep, thanks. So for Elizabeth, with the photos, because you made it sound like not many of the photos still have metadata yet. But once you make them available, would users be able to be like, hey, I'm interested in this photo, but there's no info? Would you be able to take requests like that from users to be like, oh, okay, let's work on that one next?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So we've thought about a number of things. At this point, I think we are not ready to actually put AI into our digital repository and are thinking of this as a staff tool instead of a user tool. We already do have a request form that says, does this thing need redescription, which we're already using. But I think it's an interesting idea to allow users to request collections to be reprocessed to see if we can get some more information out of them. So yeah, great question. Bryce?
Just a quick question for Simon. You mentioned a standard that keeps kind of text segments to 32 characters or something, and I was just wondering what standard that was. I missed it.
Oh, yeah. Nina could probably answer it better because she is far more trained in such things than I am, but it's CEA 6. Shit. 6. Nina
608.
can finish it. 608. Yes.
Yeah, so it's a broadcast standard of like how many characters per line for readability on a standard def television, basically.
Well, thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Meg. How have you or would you think about signaling to end users that descriptive metadata was generated to some extent with generative AI?
Yeah, I think that is a fantastic question, and that's something that's come up, and Simon's nodding his head because he's on this project with Amazon, is something that's come up of what responsibility do we have to be able to mention that we are creating hybrid metadata. So it's not metadata that's entirely generated by machine, it's also by human. I think at this point, we know that we have to supply something. Whether it be a statement of metadata in this metadata record has been assisted by machine generation, by AI, is something I think we absolutely want to do. The other thing that I will say to that question is that at this point, we are not looking at AI to replace what we already do. So I think validation right now is crucial around metadata, that these records need to be validated, essentially for it to be effective.
And let me just add, specifically for transcript metadata, the AI for LAM working group, speech to text working group, is developing a schema for describing provenance metadata for caption and transcript files. So it would include information of what model was used, when it was generated, things like that. And that can be included as part of the caption file, like, or it could be a separate file. So that their discussion of that has been made and still being worked on.
Okay, Susan asks, for the photos that were evaluated, how many did you keep / publish the hybrid or machine generated description?
Yeah, so at this point, we have not replaced any of this because it was experimental at that point. But as we go into this project with Amazon and put this into implementation, we expect to do this sort of processing with whole collections. And we, as part of the project, are figuring out the workflow of how to get that into our repository metadata.
Okay, and then maybe our last one. For both presenters, were there more ethics discussions that took place at all? Something that always comes up in our institution's discussion around AI is environmental impact, and I'm wondering if you had to address anything like this or any other ethical considerations. And then Tricia seconded that.
Yeah, we can actually talk about that. That did come up for us, and we actually did monitor the power usage when we were running Whisper on our software, and I can actually, we had a slide on this. I'll just share it real quick. I wasn't sure if y'all would be interested in that or not, but yeah, so we actually did install some power monitoring software, and what we found essentially was that because Whisper runs without the monitor running, and because it runs so quickly, it's actually more power efficient to do Whisper assisted transcription than to have a purely human generated workflow, basically. So yeah, so we found that, and then we also we installed the same power monitoring software on our workstation that does other digitization tasks here. So doing analog to digital video conversion, and basically that was also very much in line with the amount of power that Whisper draws. So Whisper is basically not drawing more power than other tasks that we typically do here.
Yeah.
So.
And just adding, this of course does not include all the power used to generate the said language model, but we have no control over that, nor do we know. So this is just what we can control and what we can test. So,
yeah, like we can't speak to what is involved in training the model, but just as an end user, it's in line with what else we do here.
Yeah, and I want to speak specifically to the sustainability here. And one of the places that I was pointing here, I think, particularly around reparative description, is that there are harms that we inflict upon library staff who have to go back and look at these sorts of collections that we're talking about. And one of the things that I think makes this a more sustainable process is we are no longer asking people to do that initial analysis, and are able to chunk things out in a way that makes it more sustainable for people to be able to work with these sorts of collections that we're talking about. We're not asking, I'm thinking of, asking a person to go through an entire collection of lynchings. That's not something I want to ask my students to do. And if we can have AI take first passes on that and take on some of that burden, I actually think we're sort of existing in a more ethical space for staff. That certainly has to be balanced with environmental concerns. I think that can't be ignored, but I think there's balances on the other side where it's not just a environmental question. I think there's also other types of considerations that need to be brought into play here.
Okay, it's time to go, and I don't think we're out of questions. Thank you all so much, and I love that ethical question and answer. That was really, really fascinating that you tracked it. So thank you so much, Nina and Simon and Elizabeth. That was really fascinating, and hopefully it helps us all start looking more into AI at our institutions. So have a good day, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks again, guys. I really appreciate you doing this.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
It
thanks.
was fun.
Yeah. Hey, well, we'll talk later. Hopefully I'll see you sometime at a DLF or another conference.
Okay. Sounds good.
Sounds good. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, you
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.